I want to talk about this feeling that many, if not all of us have, deep in our heart, that we want our lives to count for something more. That we've had these dreams that our lives would really make a difference, maybe even change the world. That the prospect of just kind of going through the motions, paying off a mortgage, accumulating some stuff along the way isn't enough. In fact, I'm discovering that more and more people find that the prospect of spending their life just pursuing success alone isn't enough. To just climb the corporate ladder, grow my net worth, soon loses its meaning. And we wonder what would give our lives more purpose and more significance. A recent study at Harvard University found that more than 50% of people between the age of 50 and 65 would gladly change their career if they could find something with more meaning and purpose. Similar studies recently of the 20-something group have found that 20-somethings today have no intention of pursuing success like their baby boomer parents did. They're looking to do well by doing good. You know, 2 of our kids are out of college, like I mentioned. Carter is our oldest boy, and he's always had a passion for the environment. He studied environmental science at NC State. And so he's working for a large environmental engineering firm, learning how to clean water, to be an expert at cleaning water, because someday he wants to help provide clean water where it's needed around the world. And water will be a big issue in the next generation. Water is a big issue, isn't it, today? Our little girl, Carrie, who's 5'1¼ on a really good day, big head of curly black hair. Seems like just yesterday I brought her home from the hospital when she was about this big as a baby. Wednesday, we took her to the airport and said goodbye, and she moved to France with Campus Crusade to serve college kids and encourage and inspire and reach college kids with God's love and compassion in Montpellier, France. Kind of a happy, sad day for us, but a day that we really were nurturing her for, to care about things just bigger than her own interests. But many times, right on the heels of these dreams, our minds come up with these self-limiting ideas of why we couldn't live extraordinary, meaning-filled lives. Things like, well, you know, I'm overcommitted already, or I have some financial constraints, or I just don't have that kind of talent, or maybe I'm not spiritual enough. One lady said to me, you know, 20 years ago, I turned my dreamer off. And I said to her, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And she said, well, you know, I had 3 kids, a job. I mean, my parents were getting older, then his parents were sick, and then the dog and the cat and the PTA, and, you know, something had to give. And so I just turned my dreamer off. And she said, you can't turn your dreamer back on in 15 minutes. And I thought, gosh, that is a good point. We're going to explore what does it look like, what would it look like for you or I to live our life where we had real significance, where you felt your life really was making a difference, the kind of difference that you care the most about. It's built on a talk that Jesus was giving, or speech Jesus was giving to thousands of people, captured by a guy named Luke, and we're reading what he said in the 12th chapter of Luke. So to set the context up, there's a large crowd. Jesus is giving this kind of speech, and one guy shouts out in the middle of this deal, hey, Jesus, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me, 50%. In essence, what he was saying to Jesus is, I want more. And I don't know about you, but there have been many times that I've looked to God and said, I want more out of life. I want to squeeze the most I can out of every minute I have here on this planet. So Jesus told them right off the bat, guard your heart against greed, because it won't deliver. It'll ruin your life. He told them that life's not about possessions, that stuff won't deliver in the long run. In another spot, you know, Jesus talked about the deceitfulness of riches. And deceitfulness is kind of an interesting word to use there. Deceit is really offering one thing or promising one thing and not delivering. So money and wealth is a powerful tool, can be a blessing, but it doesn't deliver what it promises. So here's what Jesus said to them about what it would look like to live a life with real meaning and purpose. You can follow along on the screen. This is from Luke chapter 12. He said, be dressed and ready for service. Keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, and he will have them recline at the table and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. So Peter asked, Lord, are you talking about this parable to us or to everybody? And the Lord answered, who then is the faithful and wise manager, who the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. So do you notice how many times Jesus said, it will be good for this person whose the master finds him ready to serve and is attentive and is doing what they've been called to do and undistracted by stuff around them? In other words, Jesus is telling his closest friends and his followers that a real life of significance is like a house servant. It's to be like a house servant who knows his or her assignment and isn't focused on doing it. The reward is both a life of meaning and purpose now, and the reward in the future when you and I have to give an account to God for how I invested my time and my talent. So I believe Jesus is actually addressing the very issue that the guy spoke up and said, hey, I want half the inheritance. I'm looking for more out of life. And I think Jesus is saying there is nothing wrong or short-sighted about wanting more out of my life or your life. But he redirects our heart as to where to find it. And frankly, I don't think he's surprised when you and I find that success and accumulation and comfort and pleasure actually don't deliver. They don't satisfy us. I've always loved real estate. I bought my first piece of real estate when I was a teenager. My dad was my first banker. And I had this little sort of oversimplified idea in my mind, and you might relate to this. But in my mind, it was quite simple. You get the best grades you can to get into the best university so that you can get the best job, so that you can accumulate the most toys and make the most money so you can retire as early as possible. What on earth you do with the rest of your life after you retire so early, I'd never actually given any thought to, but that was my little oversimplified idea of what life was like. And then when God chose to bless our business early, it forced Linda and I to push the pause button and ask the question, why? Why did he bless our business? And what were the implications for our life? I could just keep going, building more buildings, maybe accumulating more stuff, or maybe there was something deeper and more meaningful. And I came upon the same chapter, Luke chapter 12, and the part that struck me is a part that we're going to come to in just a moment, where Jesus says to these folks, to whom much is given, much is required, or much is demanded. And Linda pointed out to me that it didn't say, to whom much is given, much is suggested, or to whom much is given, much is recommended. You know, that there would be a time when I would lock eyes with God, and I would have to give account for the fact that I have been absolutely ambushed by God's goodness. Ever since then, Linda and I have had the incredible privilege to lead our family on a faith adventure, to try to use our time, our talent, and our resources to meet the deepest needs of others. We've made lots and lots of mistakes, but we've discovered one thing is unquestionably true, that it's exactly as Jesus promised, that a life that is rich and rewarding is about serving. And I love that God always has our best interests at heart. And not only that, but someday we'll be held accountable for how well we did with what we were given to work with in this world. Now, ultimately, this is a relational deal. You know, frankly, God doesn't need me running his errands. I mean, think about how ludicrous that would be. He doesn't need me. He wants me. He's in the middle of prying my fingers loose from the stuff I hold tightly I rely on for my income, my security, my identity, so that my heart will connect with him. This is about making eye contact with God, getting your unique assignment from Him, and then going and doing it with everything that you have. So the question is, what does this really look like? It's great for Jesus to tell stories about house servants, but what does it really look like in our world? So I'd like to share with you a few stories from friends of mine around the country who are on this journey with you that are trying to figure out how to get more out of life. Not long ago, I did an event with just 10 guys in it. They all were business owners or executives. They were all in midlife, and they were looking for more significance in their second half. They were on a journey from success to significance. I started the 2-day time together by saying, all right, what is something you're so passionate about you could give your life to? And this one guy, when it came time for him, he said, honestly, nothing. He said, I'm a label printer. I'm a label printer. I'm not passionate about anything, for goodness sake. And I remember thinking, well, gosh, sorry I asked you, A little later in the afternoon, I asked the question, what is a movie that you've watched multiple times and why? He was the first guy with his hand up. He said, Seabiscuit. I've watched the movie Seabiscuit 7 times. And I'm thinking, you must have a problem. Like, I can hardly watch a movie once all the way through, but 7 times? I'm thinking, this guy's got a problem. And so I asked him, why? Why are you watching a movie 7 times? He said, I love it when they put that guy back in the saddle. Next morning we got together and I asked a question, what is something you've done over the last month or two that when you did it, you absolutely came alive? And when it was his turn, he said, I'd have to say Tuesday. Tuesday morning, I had the privilege of going downtown and bailing one of my pressmen out of jail. And I was thinking, did you hear my question? So I said, okay, so tell me, why do you enjoy bailing your pressman out of jail? And he said, because now that he's hit rock bottom, I know how to help him. You can probably see it coming. We just looked at him and said, dude, your passion that you supposedly don't have is hidden in plain view. You love putting guys, men and women, back in the saddle in their life. It was the first time in his life, at 53, that he realized what his true calling was. And as he left there, he said, I'm still the owner and the CEO of the 6th largest label printing company in America, but my calling is to put men and women back in the saddle. And he said, I happen to have 500 and some employees, and I'm going to start there. I'm going to tell my management team that if you know of anybody on our team who's falling out of the saddle in their life, I need to be first to know about it. I don't care if it's a health issue, a financial crisis, a kid with an educational problem. I don't care. It's my calling. I first met Rosalind Cook when she was in her 40s, and she'd spent her first half basically raising healthy, God-honoring kids. If there's any job on the planet that I think is significant, being a mom and having the privilege to raise kids in a way that they're healthy and serve others and honor God, that's about as significant a job, I think, as I can imagine. But she said, my job's changing now. The kids are gone, and whether I like it or not, my job description just changed. So who am I going to be now that I'm all grown up? When she was in her 40s, she took a sculpting class, and the moment she put her hands in the clay, she realized this is what she was created to do. She could just tell it. A little while later, she had a friend over, and she was working in her studio in the back of her house, working on clay, and her friend noticed a little tear coming down the corner of her eye, and she said, Rosalind, what's with the tear? And she said, well, I love this so much, but it's so selfish. And her friend said, are you kidding me? Do you think God gave you that talent and He doesn't have a plan for you to use it to make a difference in other people's lives? So I want to show you a picture of Rosalind now. Now, 2 years ago in January, I had a photographer go and capture her in this moment. This was the unveiling of a sculpture that she did, a life-size sculpture of Jesus playing with children for the new children's hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And what's interesting, take a second to look at this. What's interesting about this is when you and I walk by, we just think, this is a wonderful sculpture at the entrance to a beautiful new hospital. But what you don't see is that this sculpture is designed from her heart for a little boy or a girl looking out the window of the third floor of the hospital, the last week of their life, so they can see and experience God's love firsthand. If you look at it, you can see those kids are looking up. That's when you know that you've encountered what you were placed here on this planet to do. My wife Linda's calling is, her mission statement is to mentor moms with young kids, young moms, so that they can integrate God's wisdom into their family so that it changes the fabric of their family. That's her mission statement. So a couple weeks ago, she had 9 or 10 moms with young kids from the Cove over to our house for dinner. I love to cook, so my assignment for the night was to cook and serve dinner. And I had the privilege of watching her in the sweet spot of her calling. I mean, she's just good at it. She spent 25 years as a mom. She's been a great mom. She has a huge heart for these young moms. She's really outstanding. It's fun for me to just watch her do it. And she doesn't need a whole lot. She needs a big heart and a living room, really. That's all she needs to be able to live out her calling. And by the way, just a side note, if I could speak for a moment to guys in the room that are married. You know, over the last 14 years, I had the privilege of coaching and serving successful men on their journey to significance. And the biggest surprise for me has been that the most fulfilling thing for a guy in his second half of life isn't to find some big, challenging opportunity to change the world, although you might have the privilege to do that. The most fulfilling thing for you and I will be to help our spouse discover her calling and flourish in living it out. Now, you may not believe me, and frankly, I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me 10 years ago, but it's true. I would encourage you sometime this weekend to get some time with your spouse and just ask her, honey, what are your biggest dreams? And how can I help you live them out? And then just shut up and take notes and think about it. It'll be the most rewarding thing you do, is to help her flourish in living out her calling. Patrick McConaughey is a friend of mine who's a man's man. He's like, he eats too fast, he drives too fast. His truck is too big. He's got like this F-350 or something with way too much horsepower. But he's an oil and gas guy that takes too much risk. But he's got a huge heart. And his passion is to heal men's hearts. Now he owns a ranch. He still does his business, but he's built a team of guys, and every week there's a group of men out at his ranch, and they're healing men's hearts. Now, I went out there, and I spent a week with Patrick, and because I love to cook, I cook for them, and I had the privilege of hanging out with 10 soldiers who just came back from the war, and they all have post-traumatic stress disorder. One of Patrick's teams was a guy who led a Navy SEALs team for 10 years. When he retired, he went and got a master's degree in counseling, and he is counseling these guys during the week. Patrick is taking them horseback riding, skeet shooting, fishing in the Colorado River, and they're a great team, and they're having a blast doing it. And so this is Patrick in the sweet spot of what his contribution is. And one night after dinner, we were sitting around watching a movie in sort of the bunkhouse in his ranch. They're watching, you guessed it, Black Hawk Down, and in the middle of the movie, one guy starts sobbing. And I watched the most remarkable thing. The Navy SEAL guy was sitting right in front of me, and he reached up over the back of this guy, and he just rubbed his cheek just like that. It was the most tender thing I'd ever seen. And I realized you would have to be the toughest guy in the room in order to be that tender. I mean, if I had tried that, I would have my arm broken in 3 places. It's his unique calling. It's who he is. He's being who he was. It's his sweet spot where he can make a huge contribution for God, bringing compassion and tenderness on the heels of toughness. The question is, how do you and I get ready for service and focus on what our unique calling is? So, you know, like I mentioned, I've had this privilege of coaching and helping successful people on this journey, and they're all asking this question, what do I do with the rest of my life? The problem is the question, what do I do with the rest of my life, is too complicated. And what did our math teacher tell us about complex equations? She told us to break it up into pieces, right? Solve them separately, put it back together. It's the same way in your life and mine. If you want to figure out your calling and live it out and find a more meaningful and significant life in the process, you're going to need to break it up into different pieces. Now, I would suggest that there's 3 big issues you need to solve for. The first one is to get clear about who you are at the core. What are your strengths? What are your passions? What's your mission? You know, in Ephesians 2:10, the Bible says, "For you are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which I prepared in advance for you to do." That's your mission. What is yours specifically? The second big piece of it is to create capacity. How can you and I create the time, energy, money, excess that we can give away? If I spend all that I have on me and my family, I have nothing to offer you. So how can you and I create capacity? And the third piece is to design the context in which you can serve. The label printer guy found that his business environment was the perfect platform to live out his calling. Very often, your corporate environment or your business environment or your work environment is a perfect platform to live out your calling, or your family or some other organization. So what context is right for you? Now, this little drawing is often helpful to the folks I often work with, and it may be helpful to you. If you think about it this way, think of 3 circles that overlap in the middle, and one is, who are you at the core? Second is, how do you create capacity? Thirdly, in what context should you serve? Think about these circles where they converge. This red spot in the middle is your sweet spot. It's where you see in these stories. Now, what's interesting about these 5 stories I shared is that it looks to you and I, from this vantage point, like a no-brainer. Of course, the Navy SEAL guy and Patrick are doing that kind of stuff on a ranch. And of course, Linda is mentoring young moms. But I can tell you, for every one of those 5 people, it wasn't clear to begin with. It was very confusing and frustrating for them. They had to go through this process of saying, who am I at the core? What are my strengths? What are my passions? And what's my mission? And over here, they had to ask, you know, how could I create extra time in my schedule? If Philip Kemp doesn't have the time to take Fridays off, he can't serve those women. He can't mentor those students. If he was out golfing on Friday, he wouldn't have had that kind of a letter show up at his home that deeply impacted his kids' lives. How do you create extra time, extra money, extra spiritual overflow? Wish this thing had spell check. And then in terms of context, what's the best platform for you? What organization can you live out your calling? What role in that organization fits you the best? This is a great design tool for you to just stop and think about. You could even work on it this weekend. Just take those 3 circles and put in, what are your biggest strengths, greatest strengths, and passion? How could you create just a few hours? You won't get it right. First of all, you'll try different things. But to make it even simpler, think of it like this. Get clear, get free, and get going. My very first effort at this was mentoring prisoners. Well, I took every Thursday afternoon, I mentored some prisoners from noon till 4 or 5. Turned out I was terrible at mentoring prisoners. I mean, it was a bad day in prison when I showed up. And the only good thing was that they felt better when I finally left. So, do you think that was a waste of time? No, it was very valuable. It helped me understand who I am and who I'm not, and it was a humbling thing to be kind of a loser at that, and it was good all the way around. And so you won't get it right the first time, but you can try. Now, that's the first piece of what Jesus was saying. It's the reward part of his comments in Luke 12. There's a second piece to it, and this is what I call the responsibility part. The second part is that you and I are responsible for how we use our time, talent, and treasure. And so here's what Jesus said to his closest friends. This just picks up where we left off before, again in Luke 12. The servant who knows the master's will and doesn't get ready or doesn't do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds brutal to me. I mean, imagine like if in your work environment, the people who work for you, you said, look, Tuesday, show up, be focused, be prepared, and if you underperform, I'm going to beat you. I don't know. I have a sneaking suspicion it wouldn't go over well. So obviously, Jesus is telling a story designed to illustrate a point. And the point is that there is the cost of not being ready, not staying focused on what you're called to do is very high. And I've seen it with my own eyes, and you probably have as well. I had a guy come up to me after an event I was doing, and he said, you know, gosh, he said, I took a brand, national brand, that if I mentioned it, you'd know it, from being a regional company to being a national company to being an international company. He said, along the way, I missed family vacations. When I was there, I wasn't really present. I was kind of strapped to my BlackBerry. I never learned how to be my wife's soulmate. I pushed my body too long and too hard, and the stress finally caught up to me. He said, you know, today, I've lost the most wonderful woman you could be married to. I've lost my health, and I've lost my girl's respect. And all I'm left with is a big, huge pile of cash, and it means nothing to me. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd rather take the beating that Jesus talked about than this. His point is that you lose when you just focus on yourself. When you have been given much in this life and you squander it by drifting or through self-absorption, you not only lose the reward in heaven, you lose the richness of a life of significance. And in fact, you suffer the loss of what you were trying so hard to hold tightly to. It just goes away. You know, it's not uncommon for me to be on the phone with a CEO or a successful entrepreneur and to hear the deep sadness and the remorse in their voice when I ask them the question, what has all your winning cost you? And this begs the question, who was Jesus talking to when he said, to whom much is given, much is required? Who are the people who've been given much? I know in my situation, without a shadow of a doubt, I have been incredibly blessed, and I will be incredibly responsible. Now, I think that once you and I have been given more than we need, not more than we want, more than we need, that we have much. So I think someday when you and I connect with God face to face, we'll have a final exam, a two-part final exam. Wouldn't it be helpful if you could get the final exam before you go into class in university or in high school or something? It would kind of be helpful. I think you and I have a heads up on the final exam. I think it's two parts to it. I think the first part is, what did you decide about Jesus and his offer of forgiveness, which is offered to you with open hands? And I think the second part is, what did you do with what I gave you to work with? Not what somebody else was given, or Billy Graham was given, or Bill Gates was given. What did you do with what I gave you to work with? Now, I want to take just a second and talk to those of you who are here who find yourself in a place where you've been successful. You know, I find it interesting that Jesus points out that there are some people in this group that have been given more. So you may not be financially independent. You may feel like in the last couple of years you took a bit of a hit financially, but in your most honest moment, you look yourself in the mirror, you realize that you have been successful. I would encourage you to have the courage to acknowledge that, to realize where it comes from, and then to think about the implications and the responsibility in your life. Now look, if Jesus makes it clear that there's a segment of the group that have extra responsibility, wouldn't it make sense for the church to have something specifically and uniquely designed for you to help you think through what to do with the implications of your success? We've had for a number of years a little simple program called the Halftime Small Group. You know, halftime is a pause in midlife to take a look back over your shoulder and take stock, and then to dream about what could be next, and then to chart a course with those you love towards a more meaningful and significant second half. And so it is a 6-week curriculum designed to help people who've been successful to really make eye contact with God, to gain clarity, to get input from your peers. You know, this is a journey you don't want to go on your own. You notice in every one of these stories, other people were influential in their life. You need a place where you can come, where nobody's wowed by your success, where you can think your confusion out loud and gain clarity about what your second half could be about. If a group isn't your thing, we can help you one-on-one. But I encourage you, don't go on this journey alone. Stop by one of those tables, grab a copy of From Success to Significance. It's a roadmap for you to figure out what's next. So let me wrap up with this thought. If your heart is longing for more significance, more real significance in your life, I would encourage you to get clear about who you are at the core. Get free of the stuff that's cluttering up your life and holding you back, and get going. And what's interesting is that serving God and others, you'll find not only greater joy in meeting, but this significant stuff kind of sneaks up with you along the way. I wouldn't chart out on a course to try to find significance. I would chart out on a course to try to serve others. And in the process, God will infuse significance into your life. Ultimately, the only source of significance comes from the fact that the creator of the universe just happens to be in love with you and me.